The Yemen civil war is a conflict overwhelmed by proxies, death, and individual motives. Since the start of the conflict, thousands of innocent civilians have died because of numerous foreign sides all fighting for their own interests. The Yemen civil war, as the UN describes, is currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The initial conflict was ignited by the Arab Spring in 2011. The president at the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was criticized by different political groups for causing nationwide unemployment and implementing a system based around nepotism and general legislative corruption. The first to be critical were the Houthis, a politically motivated Shia rebel group which has been in the conflict with Abdullah Saleh's government for years. Following violent intervention in 2012, the Houthis forced Saleh out of place of Mansour, the previous vice president. This is when it got spicy. The UN hosted a committee which helped formulate decisions for the future of Yemen. The committee planned to create a new federal system made up of 6 independent federal systems, which would act under their own legislation. This pushed tensions to a boiling point, where the Houthis and the Hirak groups both objected, as it undermined their distinct visions for the nation. The increase in conflict meant that Hadi was unable to remain in power. This created a vacuum which allowed Daesh to move in and besiege regions of the state. In response to this, the Houthis, allied with Saleh, were rapidly gaining territory, with the aim of enforcing military power. Saudi Arabia launched an aerial campaign targeting non-military zones in an attempt to restore a pro-Saudi government and form a coalition against the Iranian-supported Houthis. Simultaneously, the US carried out a campaign aimed at defeating Daesh, while supplying weapons to the Saudis. In desperation, Saleh then offered a peace deal which led to the anger's Houthis murdering them. Today, all foreign powers except Iran are targeting the Houthis. See, we told you, proxies. The conflict has led to hundreds of legislative and humanitarian rights violations. The UN believes that over 10,000 Yemenis have died, with more than 3 million refugees at risk of starvation. Based on this heavily complex story, we decided to focus on how the New York Times had changed their framing of the conflict over 2 distinct periods, 2015 and 2018. Our research question is as follows. In what ways have the frames used in the coverage of the Yemen civil war changed between 2015 and 2018? With the help of previous research conducted, shout out to Amy V., we decided to focus on the following frames. First, the humanitarian. This reports the way in which the conflict has affected individuals or various groups. Second, the conflict and violence. This reports the conflict between 2 sides and explicitly focuses on the violence of the conflict. Third, the responsibility. This frame suggests who was responsible for the breakout of the conflict, and potentially who should be responsible to end it. Fourthly, the economic political frame. This reports the way in which the conflict has affected political and economic atmospheres in Yemen, as well as other countries involved. We also assumed that there would be more than just 4 frames in all of the articles, so we decided to leave space open for more frames if needed. We ended up finding 2 further frames. The first one, the resource frame. We found this to be most common in the intersection between economic and political and the conflict and the violence. The prevailing similarities between the 2 centered on certain groups holding supply routes or moving control resources. Secondly, we added the threat to national and international health frame. We found this to be deeply intertwined between the political economic and the humanitarian frame. This is due to the fact that the crisis had created a breeding ground for bacterial infections both inside Yemen and outside Yemen. This could potentially cross borders and could quickly become an epidemic. National health is a key determinant in development of a nation, and this could influence many. To find our articles, we used the database Factivia and narrowed down our time frame to condense the material possibly turned out. We refined our search from the 1st of March until the 1st of April in 2015 and 2018. We then took the first 20 articles for each data period, removing irrelevant articles or links, and used these for the basis of our analysis. We conducted a sample analysis of 12 articles regarding the subject of the Yemen civil war to see if our initial codes would be appropriate for analyzing the final material we would use. As a group, we analyzed the same 12 articles to see how framing compared between the coders. That's us. We found there were many frames that could be applied to each article simultaneously. Therefore, we decided that we should find the most prominent frame in each article and use that as the final. We created a table to see whether we agreed or disagreed on the frames of each article. We used the Kalfa equation to determine our intercoder reliability. Our Kalfa came out to 79%. This confirms that our variables and coding was reliable, to a certain extent. We used a framing matrix to investigate the substance of each article. We followed this format for all 40 articles. As you can see, we considered reasoning and framing devices when analyzing the articles, and we included short descriptions and quotations to help further our analysis. Having collected our data and creating our framing matrices, we presented our results in this graph. It was clear that in both years, the economic and political frame was the most prominent. However, the number remained consistent, suggesting that this is a key frame choice by the New York Times. Furthermore, this equally held true with the humanitarian and responsibility frames, which produced similar results. What was most interesting was the choice of extra frames that were used. Both 2015 and 2018 produced two very different additional frames which were completely unrelated. Neither of these frames could be translated into articles taken from the corresponding dates. In this way, it was interesting how various events changed the framing of the conflict. For example, in April of 2015, the Saudi Arabian government had begun military airstrikes on non-military zones, more specifically, airports. This meant that vital resources were not reaching the citizens of Yemen. Hence, the resource frame was created. Furthermore, in 2018, mass infection leading to antibiotic resistance was again caused by Saudi-led bombing. In this case, even though both frames referred to the same issues, the frames were used totally different. Before we get to the discussion of the results, we think it's important to explore the differences of our process. One of these challenges was deciding which frames fit into which news articles. This is because the frames are not exact. There will always be competing interpretations that suggest one article is best described as one certain frame. We found that the responsibility and the political frames especially had some overlaps, similarly as did the humanitarian and the violent frames. A detailed analysis of our framing matrices and our coding frame showed that some thought-provoking results. Interestingly, a majority of articles were explained through the economic and political frame. As we have already mentioned, the Yemen war is characterized by multiple parties with competing interests and agendas. It is not surprising that there is little change in the reference to economic and political frames. However, as was shown in the framing matrices, the articles were consistently put in war in the context coming from an American perspective. On the one hand, we expected this. A news agency in America is informed by the country that its audience lives in. On the other hand, it puts forward an interesting suggestion to how an American news agency represents war in other nations. Does this reveal the United States' attitude as the global protector for democracy and power? Well, it is certainly grounds for further studies. What we can do is compare the differences between two dates. The graph clearly shows us that the articles under conflict and violence and responsibility frames have increased in the 3 years since the war began. Together with the additional threat to national and international health, there are certain influences that we can draw. The prevalence of these frames suggests that the New York Times moved to only include stories of a more immediate and shocking nature. This may be because the war has lost interest over time. Overall, the analysis demonstrates the need for further exploration of the nuances of the Yemen civil war and greater representation of civilian factors, not only the political ones. War takes lives every single day and displaces more and more people to the surrounding areas. It is ripping Yemen apart. We can talk about the relevance of news stories and why American people should care about an article, but until we talk about that every day, this war will always remain forgotten.